Everybody having a good time? Well, I'm here to ruin that for you. Now that's what's going to happen if anyone talks. All right. The title of this presentation, which I've tried to make as animated and as interesting as possible, because I guess most Zeitgeist events do have at least one really long, grueling, boring lecture. But this one, I'm attempting to make a multimedia experience out of it, called Art Science Alloys. I would like to note that the original version of this, which I completed at about 5 in the morning last night, was about 45 minutes, and I've had to condense it down to 15 for the sake of this event. So please bear with me. It's going to jump very quickly, so please pay attention. The term art science alloys is borrowed from the title of the doctoral thesis of this man, Iannis Xenakis. And apart from having the most kick-ass sounding name ever, Xenakis, he is best known today as a 20th century modernist composer, and as I will describe, his ideas regarding music came from a very unique place. As with all artists, the time period of existence has great relevance and influence. Fighting for the Greek resistance during World War II against fascism, he was shelled in the face by a tank, losing a good portion of his left side along with part of his vision. He was exiled from Greece as a political dissident after the war, moved to the United States for a while, and then eventually settled in Paris, where he made his living as an architect. As most are aware, the 20th century marked an explosion of abstraction and the rejection of traditional norms. The formless art of abstract expressionist painters like Jackson Pollock, to the works of James Joyce, who decided to create a completely different literary vocabulary with multiple dimensions. This is an excerpt, if you can read it, from Finnegan's Wake from 1939, which is not only written in numerous languages simultaneously, with some he literally just made up, it's also abstractly referencing other historical literature that go back to the classics thousands of years. I challenge anyone out there to read these 700 pages of insanity that he put forward. As far as music, the so-called classical music genre of the 20th century worked to abandon traditional forms and create new structures as well. 12-tone serialism was a very popular approach, which, as per the philosophy of Arnold Schoenberg, attempted to emancipate the dissonance, or to free the discordal qualities from their apparent subservience to the consonants, as per the laws of traditional tonality. Very quickly, if anyone here isn't familiar with basic tonal harmony, which I think is important to run down, in about 500 BC, Pythagoras discovered that a single tone, every single tone we hear is actually accompanied by a series of overtones called harmonics, and most notable are the fifth and the third, and they comprise basically the major chord that we tend to hear. And the most dominant, of course, is the fifth, but if you stack these fifths, the natural structure, you get all 12 notes of the chromatic scale as you see on a piano. In short, we perceive consonance and dissonance in musical harmony because of this acoustical phenomenon, and our bodies, being of course created by the same physics, respond sympathetically. So when we hear, say, the instability of a diminished seventh chord, we're very relieved when it resolves itself. The 12-tone serialists adopted a very different model for note organization, rejecting this, using atonal phrases, and they organized it a certain way, tone rows they were called, and they assumed people would aesthetically adjust. Now, This actually had a deeper symbolism. The abstraction and the experimentation moved towards parallels with the given outcry of social oppression, violence in the industrializing 20th century world. I think the best term to use is liberation. Dane Rudyard, in this time, a rather mystical figure, was also a musician, wrote a book called Dissonant Harmony, a New Principle of Musical and Social Organization. And he stated, dissonant music is thus the music of true and spiritual democracy. It abolishes tonalities, exactly as the real Buddhistic Reformation abolished castes in the Brotherhood of Monks. Legend Duke Ellington, jazz legend, also was explicit about the social implications of this dissonance with respect to existing racism. In an interview, he said, "That's the Negro's life. Hear that chord? Dissonance is our way of life in America. We are something apart, yet an integral part." Now, coming back to Xenakis, this is the artistic climate that he was exposed to. And in this climate of liberation and this move towards experimentation and abstraction, along with the darkness that was the 20th century in many ways, with rampant bigotry, 2 massive world wars, McCarthyism, and the like, Xenakis still went further. He was interested in a larger order liberation, specifically the unification of the arts and the sciences. His core merger personally was architecture, mathematics, and engineering, and linking them to music, something he later called formalized music. More broadly, and this is slightly an aside, this idea was later embraced by famous microbiologist Edward O. Wilson when he coined the term consilience, or the unity of knowledge. And the truth of the matter is that when you dig deep intellectually, everything has an interdisciplinary synergy. You say nutrition. You can't talk about nutrition without talking about biology. You can't talk about biology without talking about physics. You can't talk about physics without talking about mathematics, and so forth. However, Xenakis took more of a structural view in that he saw the arts and sciences as sharing the same process via the nature of human thought, experimentation, and logic, along with the shared influence of culture. He states, "The universes of music, classical, contemporary, pop, folk, traditional, avant-garde, etc., present amazing diversities, rich in new creations, but also fossilizations, ruins, and wastes, all in continuous formation and transformation like the clouds. This is explained by the proposition that music is a socio-cultural phenomenon subordinated to a given instance in history. However, one can distinguish parts that are more variant than others, and thus form materials of consistency, resulting from diverse epochs of civilizations, materials that move in space, created, hurled, clashing, influencing, and annihilating each other." He then goes on to describe the underlying process of inference and experimentation, which the arts and science share. He states, "Art has something of an inferential mechanism, which constitutes the ground on which all theories of mathematical sciences, physics, and those of living beings. The games of proportions in architecture, literature, music, painting, theater, dance, and so on are all made on the terrain of inference in the strict logical sense. Besides this terrain exists the experimental mode that challenges or confirms the theories created by the sciences, including mathematics. Since the development of non-Euclidean geometries, mathematics has also proven to be an experimental science over the longer span of time than other sciences, while the arts are also governed, of course, by the experimental mode. Indeed, there are not, and without a doubt never will be, objective criteria for absolute and eternal truths of the validity of a work of art, just as there is no scientific truth as definite." And finally, he draws a unique poetic qualification, which is important to his character, where he elevates the arts from the sciences due to aesthetics. But in addition to these modes of activity, inferential and experimental, art lives in a third, that of immediate revelation, that is neither inferential or experimental. The revelation of beauty is made at once, directly to the person ignorant of art, just as to the connoisseur. Revelation makes the force of art, and it seems its superiority over the sciences, because living in the 2 dimensions of the inferential and experimental, art possesses this third possibility, the most mysterious of all, the one that makes the objects of art escape any aesthetic science, all the while indulging, as he put it, in the caresses of the inferential and the experimental. I love that. Now, Xenakis, as you might imagine, was long attacked as the anti-musician due to his methods, an intellectual who put theory before musicality and aesthetics. This is really false as far as intent. Xenakis was about the revelation more than anything else. To him, the revelation was the path to liberation. Everything else was merely a tool. The second thing Xenakis wanted to do was amplify the aesthetic of underlying phenomenon in our lives, which went largely unnoticed. One core element of many of his works is what is termed stochastic. Stochastic means non-deterministic, and only probabilities can be used to gauge future events or outcomes. An example from physical science is Brownian motion, as it's termed, which describes the chaotic motion of particles suspended in a fluid or gas resulting from collisions, if you can envision that. He also looked at stochasticism in a more generalized way, not just based on the equations, because he could recognize these patterns intuitively. He stated in an interview, "Everyone has observed the sonic phenomenon of a political crowd of dozens of hundreds of thousands of people. The human river shouts a slogan in a uniform rhythm. Then another slogan springs from the head of the demonstration. It spreads towards the tail, replacing the first. The wave of transition thus passes from the head to the tail. The clamor fills the city, and the inhibiting force of voice and rhythm reaches a climax. It is an event of great power and beauty in its ferocity. Then the impact between the demonstrators and the enemy occurs. The perfect rhythm of the last slogan breaks up in a huge cluster of chaotic shouts, which also spreads to the tail. Imagine, in addition, dozens of machine guns and the whistle of bullets, adding their punctuations to this total disorder. The crowd is then rapidly dispersed, and after sonic and visual hell follows a detonating calm, full of despair, dust, and death. The statistical laws of these events, separated from their political and moral context, are the laws of the passage of complete order to total disorder in a continuous or explosive manner. They are stochastic laws." It was this line of thinking that inspired one of his first works, Pithopracta, which was actually based on stochastic Brownian motion and probability equations. This is a few bars of the conceptual score, and here is an excerpt. While the Beatles thought about the sun and manifested Xenakis thought about underlying stochastic principles that govern our lives and manifested That piece was called ST4 for string quartet, and every element you heard was arrived at by stochastic probability equations. As an architect, the crossover was even more obvious. This is a structure designed by Xenakis for the 1958 World's Fair in Brussels. The design was directly taken from his musical work, Metastasis. If you look carefully on the left, you'll notice the use of what are called hyperbolic paraboloids in the small schematic on the left, which is the building you just saw prior. And you might notice them also in the musical score on the right. While the three dimensions are more of an optical illusion, that the lines that you're looking at on the right imply a three-dimensional space, the concept is consistent from a 2D visual standpoint. And starting 2 bars before, the following video will track this aural architecture as it plays so you can hear it. To clarify, this is a full orchestra, and the lines you see scored here, that's a real score, are glissandos played by a string section. The visual crossover was very important to Xenakis. And in the 1970s, he actually helped design, build, and program the UPIC digitizing tablet computer, the only one in existence that I know of. This system allowed visual data to be drawn and then algorithmically translated into physical sound. That is the two schematics and one example of the score. The following piece, Mycena Alpha, was the first full composition done in the late 70s. And before I press play, I suggest everyone take a deep breath. Now, in this final note, because this is a rapid review of the depth of this man's work, which extends way beyond what I'm covering, Xenakis was the first to employ the idea of multimedia, something that we take for granted. He created these massive multimedia events called polytopes, where he combined light, architecture, music, and theatrics. Sadly, documentation of these events are kind of hard to find online in visual and video form, but if you look closely to the right, you'll see some of these older photographs of the parabolic forms that he used in music, and he exposed the audience to them in different experimental settings. He did a lot of this stuff in his life, including the polytope of Persepolis in the Iranian desert in 1971, which was enormous, which was, believe it or not, actually recreated in 2010 in Los Angeles in a very minimalized form. I suspect none of you were there for that. Now, due to time, I have to leap ahead. All of this considered, what's my point? Every now and again, a person comes along in the world that has such powerful intuition. It takes a generation to understand the importance of what they touched upon. Xenakis was about consilient bridging of different fields of thought, showing a deep synergy between the arts, sciences, and culture itself. Through his music, he generated awareness of aspects of physical and cultural existence which we otherwise would likely not think about, let alone feel aesthetically. And it is this issue of immersive, interdisciplinary aesthetics, coupled with the firm understanding that all progress is really about inference and experimentation, that fascinates me and helps me better understand the massive societal failures being perpetuated in the world today that is putting all of our lives at risk. In short, we are suffering from a massive failure of inferential creativity. First, there is the aesthetic, this societal resonance using the same symbology, normality as we know it, the zeitgeist itself. We walk around this society feeling its reaction to us. And if we comply with the norms and traditions set, we experience a basic consonance, at least superficially, where we are in harmony and blend in very nicely. We are normal. However, the moment you move against the existing phrasing or against the existing tonality of the social order and its dominant traditions, the system tends to respond with great inhibiting dissonance. Yet, of course, progress has no other path. I mean, virtually every scientific breakthrough that has radically improved conditions on this planet has been met with massive anger, dissonance, and rejection initially. Second, this systems comprehension, a characteristic explicit in Xenakis' artistic and scientific worldview, is exactly what is missing in the current unfolding of the world today. Every major social problem we have is actually a structural result of a system force that is not being properly understood or incorporated. I'm going to briefly run down, verbally, the slides aren't for this, a series of negative global trends and also quickly reference why the trend exists due to such a failure of relationship. Unemployment right now across the world globally rising. Why? Due to ignoring the use of technological mechanization and an economy that cannot reconcile its own obsolescence regarding human labor requirements. Cancer and heart disease rising globally due to ignoring public health science driven by cost-saving factors that are inherent to the market system that pollute every facet of our world. Debt, rising globally due to ignoring the obvious reality that all money is made out of debt, loaned at interest, with the required interest money itself never actually created in the money supply. Mental illness and drug abuse, rising globally due to ignoring emotional health science, specifically biopsychosocial pressures, low socioeconomic status, and the inherent shame and disorder it manifests. Resource overshoot, we need 27 more Earths by 2050. Rising every year clearly due to ignoring the fact that we live on a finite planet while supporting, ironically, an economic system that demands infinite growth and infinite consumption. War, conflict, and destabilization, clearly rising globally due to ignoring the basic awareness that through equitable resource distribution and meeting basic human needs completely possible, this propensity will never subside unless we do so. And finally, poverty and wealth inequality, with 3,000 billionaires, 100 billionaires that can solve world poverty, extreme poverty 4 times over. Rising globally on average with 43 to 46% of the world's wealth owned by 1%, due to ignoring the natural inequality generated by the economic system's core structure, coupled with the competitive gaming business strategy that is inherent. And again, what keeps all of this in place? Us. Or more specifically, the aesthetic influence that engulfs us, the global polytope, if I was to use Xenakian phrasing, the pressures of our lives that in our attempt to be happy, and we almost subconsciously divert away from the dissonance of challenging anything, regardless of the long-term suffering on the horizon. We invariably move against challenging traditional tonalities, the normality as we know it. So to conclude, I can only leave you with a final suggestion. A quote by 13th century Persian poet Rumi: "Run from what's comfortable, forget safety, live where you fear to live, destroy your reputation, be notorious." Thank you.